The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman, and today I'm joined by Paul Holmes. Hello, Paul.
Good morning, or whatever time it is in Hong Kong.
It's a time of crisis. But anyway.
Hey, listen, we have offices in the US and the UK and Hong Kong. And sure, right now you're ahead in terms of crisis, but we're catching up as quickly as we can. So,
yeah, I mean, it's a real race to the bottom everywhere.
No kidding. At least we're not Brazil.
What a time to be alive.
No kidding.
But let's talk today about your ultra long read. I don't think the word long read does it justice.
I get carried away sometimes.
Well, actually, I read it and I thought it didn't feel like an 8,000 word story.
I wrote it. It felt exactly like an 8,000 word story.
Actually, it felt to me more like a 7,000 word story. So, it really flew by.
You're very kind.
It really did fly by. It's I think a really important long read on our website. Obviously, the headline is "Can America's Top CEOs Save Capitalism?" And in particular, it refers to the Business Roundtable's new statement on the purpose of a corporation, which to many of us in the public relations industry, that I guess the thinking espoused in this new statement is not a huge surprise. It calls on companies to put the interests of society and employees at the same level as shareholders. But before we discuss the statement, I just wanted to rewind a little bit, and maybe if you can tell us why this is important, why the Business Roundtable itself is important.
Sure. Well, look, the Business Roundtable is the organization representing American CEOs, and therefore, rather obviously and self-evidently, a significant organization. The reason this is important is, I assume you don't want a 7,000 or 8,000 word answer to that question. But essentially, for the last 22 years, the Business Roundtable has been guided by a Milton Friedman-esque view of business, which is that its only responsibility, other than acting within the law, is to make money for its shareholders. This is a statement of the purpose of the corporation that was adopted by the Business Roundtable 22 years ago, at which time it said expecting boards of directors to balance the different priorities of employees, communities, customers, and shareholders was untenable, which at the time I thought was the most cowardly thing I had ever heard an organization say about itself. I mean, just this idea that people who are paid millions of dollars, have decades of experience running organizations of their own, bring incredible expertise to the table, would find it impossible to make decisions that called upon them to find trade-offs and win-win solutions and all the things you would expect them to find, was a statement of moral cowardice that I found appalling 22 years ago. And I find it appalling that the Business Roundtable stuck with it for 22 years. Not only appalling, but also in its way completely useless. Saying that it's far too difficult for all these grizzled veterans of business to make tough decisions about stakeholder interests and that they should only focus on shareholder value maximization, actually answers nothing. First of all, there are clearly cases where taking care of your employees is good in the long term for maximizing value. It isn't always a win-lose situation. And secondly, there's nothing in there that says whether you're doing it for the next quarterly shareholder maximization or whether you're doing it for the long term. And of course, what happened once this statement came out was that everybody assumed that it meant you had to manage quarter by quarter to maximize every single dollar. It led to all kinds of perverse behaviors on business. And worse still, and I'll wrap up in a second, worse still, it became conventional wisdom that this was, in fact, the only way to run a corporation in America. So even if a CEO wanted to do the right thing for some other stakeholder group, the conventional wisdom was that he had a legal duty to be a dick.
Yeah, sure. And one of the things in your story that I found really interesting was you analyzed the events that led to the Business Roundtable adopting that kind of definition 22 years ago. The sort of prioritization of profit above all else. I think that the way CEO pay became linked to equity. Were those the two biggest factors in this shift?
Well, I think there were a number of things, right? So first of all, I think people like Friedman provided a sort of intellectual balance, philosophy here that CEOs could use to give themselves color. I think CEOs were under a massive amount of pressure because really, some 22 years ago, you were seeing the sort of first wave of hostile takeovers and the kind of rapacious capitalism that has become commonplace now. Companies that were in some cases perfectly well run, but not necessarily maximizing every quarter of financial returns, were suddenly being victimized by raiders. There were junk bonds out there that allowed you to finance takeovers. There were the movie Wall Street, which has maybe not aged as well as one might like, captured all of that. But there were other things going on in the political environment too. The first was that Ronald Reagan was extremely successful in sort of disempowering the labor movement in America, and organized labor was really the one sort of countervailing force that had the power and influence to check the worst excesses that we see now. And it was, disenfranchised under Reagan to an alarming extent. And the other thing that happened was that Reagan eliminated the very highest tax brackets. There was no point, very little point, in the 80s in paying your CEOs $200 million a year, because anything over the first sort of 10 or 20 million would be taxed at a 90% rate. And once that went away and you got to keep most of that money, no matter what tax bracket you were in or how much you made, you saw CEO pay linked to performance in certain ways that obviously led to a massive disparity between what chief executives could earn and what ordinary workers could earn. And so, there were a number of things going on in the environment that sort of moved capitalism in America towards a much less user-friendly sort of environment, unless you were a CEO or an institutional investor.
And now, of course, we've seen this move back, I suppose. Companies like Unilever, who've said they're not going to report on a quarterly basis, who said all of their brands have to be built around a purpose rather than just making money. But in terms of the Business Roundtable and the CEOs it represents,
I'll say something about that, because of course Unilever is not an American corporation.
yes,
It's
indeed,
elsewhere, and that gives it a freedom that it would not have in America. But there have been American CEOs, who have either recognized that social responsibility is not only compatible with good management, it's essential to it, because it builds and sustains long-term value. And so, yeah, I think CEOs have been CEOs are for the most part good people. I think. I don't think anybody wakes up this morning saying, I'm screwing over everybody except my shareholders today. And I think creative CEOs, Tim Cook at Apple is a great example, have found ways to push back.
So, in terms of the Business Roundtable and the sort of CEOs it represents, how influential will this statement really be? I mean, the risk, I guess, is that it's just virtue signaling and that it has no real teeth. I mean, there's no actual regulatory enforcement linked to this.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that there is certainly a risk that this will be perceived as nice words with no action, because the reality is that the environment that pushed CEOs to the maximizing shareholder value mantra and away from a more balanced view of the way business should operate, all of those factors are still in place. There are, hedge funds and private equity firms out there seeking to to attack and launch proxy battles at any company that takes its eye off the shareholder value ball for a moment or two. There's no significant labor movement left in America to act as a countervailing balance to big business. There are all kinds of incentives for CEOs to continue to pay themselves massively more than everyone else. The only countervailing force that we have out there is this growing sentiment that capitalism isn't working, that capitalism and the system we have now is failing tens of millions of Americans. And you see it most obviously in the fact that millennials now, according to a couple of recent surveys, like the idea of socialism. I'm not sure that all of them necessarily share the same notion of what socialism is, but like the idea of socialism more than they like the idea of capitalism. They've grown up with a capitalist system that has crushed their parents, that has led to rising inequality, that treats human beings as commodities to be harnessed or disposed of at whim, and they don't like it. And that's really the only thing that's happening right now, is that business is trying to, I think, soothe those people, but without something more than a mere statement from the Business Roundtable. Then it seems to me unlikely that anything will change. And I think something needs to happen beyond just words on a piece of paper.
Right, and that's where the accountable capitalism legislation comes in. This is proposed by Elizabeth Warren. and brings in many measures that would, I guess, place a check and really, I suppose, enforce the words around the Business Roundtable statement. Do you really think there's an appetite amongst these CEOs for this kind of law, though?
So it would be fairly glib of me to say, if they are sincere, then yes, they will embrace the Accountable Capitalism Act, because it actually provides them with a framework under which they can do what they say they want to do. And look, when the Accountable Capitalism Act was introduced, which I think was in March of this year, I looked at it, and I understand that this is not a common perspective among people, who are involved in the business world. I looked at it and I thought to myself, Elizabeth Warren is the most pro-business candidate that I have seen in my lifetime. That this is, I believe, a good faith effort to repair the damage that has been done to capitalism, that has led to the massive collapse in trust capital, in social cohesion that we've seen over the last 20 years, which is responsible for things like Donald Trump. Because people are so discontent with the establishment and the way things are being run in America for the benefit of a select few, that they were prepared to vote for an obviously insincere authoritarian just because he promised to shake things up and make the elites uncomfortable. Without getting into the whole question of Donald Trump being the absolute personification of corrupt capitalist elite, and the dissonance there. I mean, this is what you get when people start to lose faith in the ability of the system to help them and to make life tolerable for them. Is you get populism and you get extremism and you get chaos. And so I looked at the Affordable Capitalism Act, the Accountable Capitalism Act, excuse me, and I thought this was a recipe for stability in business, for accountability in business, and for capitalism that was fit for purpose for the 21st century and ultimately sustainable.
One of the things. Sorry, go on.
At the same time, even so, businesses. This is how the world works. Right? Doing what we do, we see it all the time. Businesses say they want to make the safest products possible, but they hate regulation that forces them to do it. Businesses say they want to take care of their employees, but they fight tooth and nail against any regulations that would force them to take better care of their employees. And the argument is always the same, that we can do it ourselves, that this is just bureaucracy, that it's government intervention in the economy, that it's all of those things, and that self-regulation works. I mean, it seems to me impossible for anybody to believe that if they go and read for 10 minutes about what's been going on at Boeing this year. But do I expect this to change? Do I expect business to say, thanks, Elizabeth, for coming up with a framework that allows us to do all the things we say we want to do without the hostile takeovers and the and the attacks on our business from outside? Thanks for all your help and support. Or do I expect them to say, no, you're imposing on us a structure that's far too rigid and you're creating a lot of, red tape and bureaucracy? Honestly, the latter seems more likely to me.
Yes.
And if that's the case, then yeah, this is a phrase that I loathe beyond the ability of words to convey. but it is, in fact, what people mean when they say just PR.
I think we can use virtue signaling as a better phrase, but I take your point.
Fair enough.
Is there anything in the, I'm going to say Affordable Capitalism Act, the Accountable Capitalism Act?
Yep.
Is there anything in there about tax avoidance and corporate tax? I mean, I assume there's obviously nothing on personal tax, but is there anything on corporate tax?
No, it's not. It's not about raising taxes. I mean, the core of it is this idea that companies, if you look at the Accountable Capitalism Act in the context of American business history, rather than in the context of the last 25 years, it's a remarkably unremarkable document, right? All it essentially says is companies get charters, and they've always operated under charters. Those charters essentially give them the right to conduct business. Right now, they're issued by states, but the idea here is to avoid a race to the bottom by making them federal charters for companies that have billions of dollars in revenue, which is only actually a few thousand companies. And those companies would then be forced to, in order to have a license to operate, which is a very familiar concept to PR people, in order to have a license to operate, they would need to, behave responsibly, and B, and this I think is where you're going to get the most pushback, allow employees to have a voice in management of the company. So you'd have directors who were elected by employees, not elected by shareholders. And this is a process, co-determination, that seems to work imperfectly well in Germany. I was going to say perfectly well in Germany. The reality is that German companies don't have the same stock market valuations as American companies necessarily, but they do have employee representation. And if you look at Germany right now, there isn't the discontent with capitalism that you see in America. And yes, there are German companies that still manage to find ways to misbehave, Volkswagen being the obvious example. But there isn't this antagonistic relationship between corporations and society. And look, I'm not necessarily saying that American corporations should just put their signature at the bottom of the Accountable Capitalism Act and sign off on it right away, but at the very least they should be entering into a dialogue about which parts of the act would help and which parts maybe should be watered down. But it seems to me that it's the best starting point we have to make the CEOs accountable for, again, what they said last week they really want.
Now, you talk a little bit in your story about the PR bit and what this might mean for the public relations industry. There's been a lot of commentary that this is, great news and just kind of reiterates the way corporations should be behaving. But it still requires fundamental changes, right? I mean, one of the things you point out is that many companies still treat investors as a separate class of stakeholder. And that surely is not going to help if they're serious about taking all concerns at the same level.
Okay, well, to clarify, I have always felt that public relations is a single function that should encompass all stakeholders. In other words, it's the job of public relations to understand and to convey to management what it is that various stakeholders, employees, communities, customers, shareholders expect from the organization, and and to provide some balance. Now, obviously, underneath that, you need people who are focused on each of those distinct stakeholder groups. So you still need people who are focused on investors. You still need people who are focused on employees. Those jobs don't go away, but they have to be. They have to have. If you're running your company for the benefit of all stakeholders, they have to have an equal voice, and they have to be balanced by somebody. And what you have right now in most organizations, not all, but most organizations, is an investor relations function that is completely separate from employee communications, community relations, and the other stakeholder representative functions. And I've never thought that was healthy. I still don't think it's healthy. I think that would need to be, addressed if you were running the company for the benefit of all shareholders, for all stakeholders, excuse me. And, I think it's then the job of public relations to be the representative within the organization of the different stakeholder groups, and also to be the representative to the stakeholder groups of the organization. And that, I think, obviously becomes even more mission critical if maintaining the goodwill of all of those stakeholders is a more significant priority than it is right now.
Mm. What are the implications for the CSR department, given that there are probably broad swathes of the industry that still think social purpose involves planting a lot of trees?
Look, if you're asking me, do I think that there will still be a lot of companies? We maybe shouldn't be so jokey about planting a lot of trees.
No, trees are really good, by the way. I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
Because Apple yesterday, I think, became the first company to sort of offer support for the Brazilian rainforest and reforestation and all of that stuff. And I wouldn't mock that or discount.
No, we're definitely pro-tree.
Yes. But I think companies can stop being defensive about or apologetic for their CSR. I'll come back to the Friedman quote, because it really has done, and this is, by the way, is why words on a piece of paper are not entirely irrelevant, because the Friedman quote was words on a piece of paper, words in the New York Times, back when the New York Times mattered. But it was still just words on a piece of paper, but it changed over a 10 or 15 year period everything about the way American business operates. But there's always been this sort of social responsibility, and companies don't do social responsibility because they're nice and altruistic and want to give shareholder money to good causes. They do it because they believe that it has value. And I believe that it has value. I believe that it drives sustainable relationships between the organization and its stakeholders. And I think that's important. And I think over time, those relationships make a company more money than being, than existing purely to extract as much value from its employees and its communities and the environment as it can, and then give all that value over to shareholders. And I think, most CEOs recognize that. That's why they do CSR, that it's good for the long-term interests of the company. But I also feel like every now and again, somebody pops their head up and makes the old Friedman argument and says, why are companies being, so nice to gay people
why are companies getting involved in political issues, or why are companies doing all this stuff that isn't their fundamental purpose? They should just be focused on, taking our money and giving it to their shareholders. And do I think those people will ever shut up? No. Do I think that this will give CEOs a little bit more cover when they ignore those people? Yeah, maybe.
Is it not weird, though, that we're living in this kind of time of such polarization? And indeed, the governments, for example, of the US and the UK are today led by people who, you would describe as unfettered by traditional restraints on capitalism and perhaps reason as well. But given that, do you not think that a statement like this from the Business Roundtable just has less chance of succeeding?
I guess it depends on what. I guess it depends on what, right, and what the root causes of what we're seeing are, and so I think at the end of the day, you come back to is it, and let's focus on Trump because we're talking about American capitalism primarily because I think it's the clearest way in which this argument can be made. So ever since the election of Trump, I have had discussions and debates with friends and colleagues in the business world about whether what we were seeing was pure, unadulterated racism, or whether what we were seeing was this anguished cry of disenfranchisement and economic disenfranchisement by people who feel that the system no longer works for them, that the system is actually rigged against ordinary working class or what we would call in the States middle class Americans in favor of a handful of CEOs and political elites. I don't think it's necessarily an either or question, right? I think that what we're seeing is that massive economic disenfranchisement, making it incredibly easy for people who want to divide us to find ways to divide it. And I think there are a lot of CEOs who recognize that. There are a lot of CEOs who recognize that we're seeing the breakdown of institutions. We're seeing people lose confidence. The Edelman Trust Barometer is not an outlier. It's a record of just how little faith Americans have in any of their institutions, whether it's politicians, the media, or big business. There's this feeling that all of these groups have in some way conspired to create a world that works really well for them and horribly for everybody else. And in that environment, it's incredibly easy to pick out scapegoats. It's incredibly easy to turn people against each other. I mean, this is the history of the world, right? Anytime that, that a whole group of people feel that nothing they do matters, that then you can turn people against other people. And so I don't think it's particularly surprising, and I do think it's kind of encouraging that CEOs have recognized that maybe something has to change if the ecosystem in which they've been able to flourish for the last 100 years is to continue, because the alternative is
for greater instability and greater chaos and greater tension and greater destruction. And that's not good for anybody. And so, I think there's a huge amount of enlightened self-interest in what we're seeing here.
Mm. As there should be, I think. Otherwise, I don't think any of this would work.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't think this is CEOs saying, "Hey, how can we make ourselves look good this year?" And I do think that there is a sincerity about it. I do think that there's a self-interest about it. But what I hope is that they don't think that they've done enough just by putting out a statement.
And just very quickly before we finish, what's your take on the companies that didn't sign up for this?
Well, some of them, a great many of them, are not publicly traded companies, so it frankly doesn't pertain to them directly. And look, I wouldn't expect unanimity, right? There are going to be some companies who feel like that for fiduciary, and I wouldn't expect everybody to be on board. But the fact that you have 180 major corporations is not nothing. It's pretty significant. And again, we say this all the time in our business, and I'm not sure that it's quite the achievement that we think it is, but at least it starts a conversation. This is a discussion that now will be taking place in every boardroom in America. How do we, do we think this is the right thing to do? The conversation, okay, now we've done this, how do we fake it enough that people don't realize that we're full of, stuff? Even those conversations have some value. There'll be dissent in boardrooms, and there'll be this, but at least there's a conversation taking place. I think that has to be a good thing. I sort of, and because I would like to talk about this, I'm sort of more interested in some of the companies that did sign. It's the fact of the matter is that Johnson & Johnson is credited with having been the primary author of this.
Quite a week it's having.
In a week when it was hit with a $500 million settlement for its role in the opioid crisis. How do we reconcile or balance those two things? The opioid crisis is in many ways the ultimate example of what we're talking about, an industry or a segment of an industry that was so focused on making as much money as it could, that it was prepared to, at the very least, enable, and at the very worst, encourage an enormous public health crisis. And the fact that one of the companies at the center of that is also one of the companies driving the change that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes, that's complicated.
Okay, well, Paul, thank you so much. I think you've got to go out and walk your dogs.
I do.
So
one of them just jumped up on the sofa here to make that point.
Right. Yeah. Well, he's not waiting around for the Business Roundtable or otherwise. Thanks very much. Do read the story. It's on our website. It's behind the paywall, but it's worth every cent. And we'll be back soon. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.